Hi there, I'm Emma Shortis. I'm Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs here at the Australia Institute. Welcome to our webinar series. I begin, of course, by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today. We acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this place. We would also like to acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be tuning in today. And thank you all so much for tuning in. If you don't already, you can hear more from us by subscribing to our podcast, Follow the Money, where we explain big economic issues in plain English. Our next webinar after this one is with renowned economist Stephanie Kelton. And you can sign up for that on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. The Australia Institute is independent, but only because our amazing community supports us to do our work. If you want to support us to continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting us with a small tax-deductible gift today. Now, just a few little Zoom tips before we get stuck in. You can type in any questions that you might have, and we've got a big audience today, so I suspect there will be quite a few. You can type those questions into the little Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and you can also upvote other people's questions. So if you see one that you like, please upvote it because that will help me to find the most pertinent and topical questions. Please do keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we will have to boot you out. And finally, this is a live event and it is being recorded. So the video will be available tomorrow at australiainstitute.tv. But it's my pleasure now to welcome my guest for today, Hugh White. Hugh is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University. He has been a journalist. He has served as an intelligence analyst with the Office of National Assessments, as a senior advisor on the staffs of Defence Minister Kim Beazley and Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and as a senior official in the Department of Defence. He's written several books, including most recently, How to Defend Australia. But Hugh is with us today to discuss his flagship essay in the latest edition of Australian Foreign Affairs, which is called Dead in the Water, the AUKUS Delusion. And alongside really impressive essays by Susanna Patton, Elizabeth Buchanan and Andrew Davies, Hugh has written a detailed, clear-eyed and highly accessible and readable take down, really, of the AUKUS Pact, which he's called Fatal Shores. AUKUS is a grave mistake. Now, in this essay, Hugh asks several critical questions about the AUKUS deal, questions really that should have been asked at the outset and which arguably are not being answered by the people who need to answer them most. Pretty basic questions like, does Australia actually need nuclear submarines and will this plan actually work? And given that Hugh's answer to both of those questions is a pretty firm no, he then asks questions like, how did we get here and what can we do about it? So to discuss these questions and more, no doubt, it's my pleasure to welcome Hugh White. Hugh, thanks for coming.
Well, very nice to be with you, Emma.
So, now, Hugh, I'm going to start with a really easy, straightforward question. Why is it that you are so completely convinced that we absolutely cannot pull off the AUKUS deal?
Well, because nuclear-powered submarines are astonishingly complex systems, very difficult to build, very difficult to operate, very difficult to maintain. And in order to follow what the government rather optimistically calls the optimum pathway towards acquiring this capability, a whole lot of things are going to have to go right. Almost every one of which I think is much more likely to go wrong than right. And so just to give you a quick sketch, the first thing we have to do is to maintain our present submarine capability. We have 6 Collins-class submarines. They've been in the water now since the 1990s. They're reaching the end of their life. And they badly need an upgrade called, in the sort of defensive speak, the life of type extension, LOTE, LOTE. And that's in itself a huge, incredibly expensive, very complex task. We're starting it far too late. We haven't started yet. The work won't really begin until 2026. There's a very real chance that before any nuclear submarines arrive in Australia, our conventional powered submarine capability will have dropped away. And that means that we can't train crews, because the only way to learn to drive a submarine is to take it to sea. And if we don't have submarines that are in service and serviceable, we can't develop what the Navy calls the crew training pipeline. And so we'll end up without any crews even to operate our conventional submarines before the nuclear ones arrive. So that's just the first one. And then the next step in the process is we're meant to receive nuclear-powered submarines from the United States, kind of an interim capability with the US Virginia-class submarines. They're meant to start arriving in the early 2030s, and there are several reasons why that might well not happen. Mm-hmm. The first is that we might not be ready to take them on. Even if we manage to keep the Collins boats going and we can continue to have crews that can operate conventionally powered submarines, it's quite likely that we won't have built up the extraordinary range of incredibly critical and difficult skills that are required to safely and effectively operate nuclear powered submarines by, less than a decade. And then there's the very high likelihood, even if we do that the United States will change their mind and say they don't want to give it or sell them to us. And there's a couple of really good reasons why they might not do that. The first is they do not have enough Virginia-class submarines of their own. They are, desperately short of these boats. And this is very well acknowledged in the US defence community. And they're not building nearly as many as they need to. Roughly speaking, they're delivering about 1.2 new Virginia-class each year. And in order to reach their goals, they need to deliver well over 2 Virginia-class a year. And so it may well be that when the time comes, they just don't have any to spare. Even if they do have some to spare, it would make no strategic sense for the United States to pass those submarines to us unless they're absolutely sure that they would be available to the United States in the event the United States faces a war. And this is not a question as to whether the submarines, once they're passed to us, would be a sovereign Australian capability. I'm prepared to accept that they would be. But the United States can still demand, as a condition for us receiving those submarines, that we commit in advance to using them to support the United States, particularly if the United States goes to war with China.
And we can imagine a scenario in which they wouldn't do that, can we?
Well, I just think it's unthinkable that the United States would decide to give us submarines without being absolutely sure that they can have them back. And what's more, very senior US officials like Kurt Campbell, who was until recently the great sort of Asia Supremo in the White House and the godfather, if not the actual father of the AUKUS plan, has made it absolutely crystal clear. He said out loud on public occasions that providing the submarines to Australia is just like having them ourselves. Well, I just think it's extraordinarily hard for the Australian government to make that commitment. And I therefore think it's very unlikely that the US government will actually provide them to us. And then, of course, the chance that Donald Trump comes in. And I mean, when I wrote the essay, Donald Trump looked like a bloke who had a very good chance of winning the nomination and maybe, just conceivably might win the election come November. But in the months since then, well, he's virtually got the nomination wrapped up and the polling, and, we're still 8 months out, but there's a real chance that he'll be the next president. And if he's the next president, there is a real chance that he will just walk away from AUKUS. Mm-hmm. He'll walk away from AUKUS because it's a Biden initiative, and therefore, by definition, not the sort of thing, the sort of thing he'd be keen to trash. But also because, he is all about stepping back from US alliances and keeping things at home. The idea that under Trump, the United States would pass nuclear-powered submarines to Australia when they don't have enough of their own seems to me to be simply, well, very unlikely. And then, I mean, we shouldn't joke about this, but then there's the whole British end, because after we received the US Virginia-class submarines, whilst they're filling in the gap, we're meant to be working with the British to design and build a new, what's called the AUKUS-class submarine. And the plan there is that the British will start building that sometime in the 30s, that will deliver the first boat for Britain out of the British yards in the late 30s, and then Australia will start building them for ourselves in Adelaide and deliver them in the early 40s. Now, the British submarine enterprise is extraordinarily stressed. They have a huge problem building and maintaining their present fleets of nuclear submarines. They have two kinds, ballistic missile firing submarines and attack submarines, which is the kind that we'll be getting. They're having huge trouble building and maintaining their present fleets. They're having huge trouble crewing their present fleets. They've got a huge project on to replace their ballistic missile firing submarines as well as their attack submarines. The chances of them being able to develop and start building the AUKUS boat in time to meet our schedule is very low. The chances of them having really major problems in that project, even not just running late, but running right into the sand altogether, is very high. And so I think there's a very good chance that that bit will fail. And then, of course, there's the task as to whether Australia can build these boats in Adelaide. I mean, these are extraordinarily complicated machines. They draw on a whole lot of sets of skills that Australia simply does not have. And even with, 15 years to get started, our chance of being able to find the workforce required to build these and then deliver them on time is very low. And it's worth bearing in mind, even if everything goes according to plan, we won't have the fleet of 8 nuclear-powered submarines in service until the mid-2060s. And nothing ever goes according to plan. And so we're probably talking about the mid-2070s. Often people focus too much on the date when the first boat's delivered. But if one submarine is not a capability, it's a hobby. a real capability, an operationally and strategically significant capability is 6 boats. That's why I've got 6 boats at the moment. And we won't get, on the most optimistic interpretation, we won't get 6 boats until the late 50s. So, and of course, separate question, I don't think we need them anyway. So I think it's quite likely that at some stage, with all of these very difficult hurdles to overcome, there's going to come a point when a future Australian government just says, we're out of here.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we'll be in a world of hurt. But
yeah, okay. Well, I mean, we were certainly...
Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
Not at all. What you've done is outline a kind of incredible list of risks, I think, without even getting to the question of what we need them, whether we need them. I think one of the risks that you didn't mention, just to add to that list, and one that isn't, I mean, at least I don't think is spoken about as much as those kind of more immediate concerns, is the enormity of the decision to actually go nuclear. Yeah. So nuclear power, of course, has been in the news a lot domestically this week for rather ridiculous reasons, but predictably, many of us, when AUKUS were first announced, said, well, this is going to mean that certain forces in Australia are going to try for a domestic nuclear industry. But the actual fact of having nuclear, building and maintaining nuclear reactors in Australia is a huge decision that also presumably comes with significant risk. Yes, look, it does. I mean, one of the most surprising things about the whole AUKUS story so far is how willing a very broad spectrum of Australian opinion was to accept the idea of nuclear-powered submarines when the idea had never been raised or ventilated or seriously discussed broadly in Australia before. No government had ever tried to prepare public opinion for this idea. There had been very deeply embedded resistance to the idea of nuclear power, civil power in Australia. And yet all of a sudden, the idea was sort of thrown on the table by, Scott Morrison back in 2021, and right across the spectrum, including, of course, the Labor Party, they said, yeah, great idea, let's go with this. Now, I wonder whether it's because people didn't actually understand that what nuclear propulsion in the submarine means is there's a nuclear reactor in these things. There is, the nuclear reactor is critical. There is a nuclear chain reaction in there which needs to be controlled 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for the full life of the reactor. And quite apart from the questions of waste, this is an immensely demanding risk management task. Australians have systematically proved themselves to be very reluctant to take on that immensely demanding risk management task in other contexts. And yet
they sort of said, oh, yeah, fine, that's okay. And we'll have these things lurking right in the heart of our cities. Now, this surprised me, to be honest. And I think one of the things that's one of the other issues that I didn't mention, but which is implied by your question, is that I think opposition in Australia to this will build up as we have, as you know, the implications become clear and people start to think about it more. And it may well be that the federal opposition's recent flirtation with the idea of civil nuclear power issue will actually raise these issues and start people thinking more seriously about the question more broadly. So another, so to speak, point of failure in this very failure-prone system is that Australian domestic support for the whole idea, leaving aside the strategic and defence things, which are, so to speak, my part of the ship, as the Navy say, the domestic opinion here will walk away from it.
Yeah, look, I suspect you're right, because I mean, the question of waste is another one.
Oh yes, and that's a very major issue. You know, the nuclear waste generated by the sort of reactors that would power the kind of submarines we're talking about buying is very high level, very difficult to store. No country has worked out how to do it. They're just sort of putting it away and hoping for the best.
And that our two alliance partners are hoping we'll take some of their
that's right. There's certainly no question that we're going to, very clear that they're expecting us to look after our own, and I'm sure they'd like us to look after theirs as well. So that's a whole different deal. But I just make this point. I mean, I do think the waste issue is very significant, but to me, it's less immediate, at least, than the issue of how sure we can be that our old dear Royal Australian Navy that has difficulty running a diesel engine is going to be entrusted to run nuclear reactors in vessels which are going to be sailing in and out of Australian ports. I mean, this is a major challenge. Now, you know, I think, now, of course, they would argue that nuclear-powered submarines have been operating for 70, 80 years now, and they sometimes say there have been no accidents. That's not true. But, you know, the range of accidents has been relatively limited. But that is been because the management of these things is extraordinarily dense and complex and sophisticated. And the question is, you know, how confident can we be that our institutions are going to manage that level of custodianship of these extraordinarily dangerous and complex systems? And I think the answer is, you know, we can't be. That the Navy we have today is not an institution that has the kind of record that would lead you to think that they can be trusted with this responsibility. Now, maybe they'll change in the next 25 years.
You seem sceptical.
Well, particularly when it's not a hurdle we need to get them to jump over, because we don't need nuclear-powered submarines. Our strategic needs, our operational needs, would be better satisfied, I would argue, with conventional boats. So why put yourself through all of this, a very improbable plan, entailing immense costs and risks to deliver a capability that we don't need anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll come back to that question of need. But I just want to get into that question of Defence's ability to kind of manage these projects, because you've mentioned, you know, that we really can expect both cost blowouts and timeline blowouts, because that's kind of what the history of these big projects tells us. You know, if you look at the Hunter program, if you look at even at the F-35s, you know, and this isn't a problem that's isolated to Australia. It's one that affects the US and the UK. You know, the Astute program is almost older than me. So what is it about this kind of defence planning? Like, why is defence planning seemingly so isolated from the rest of what we might call the kind of the real economy and the requirements of you know, meeting project timelines and meeting them on budget?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and there's a couple of bits to the answer. One is that you know, I've been on the other side of this. You know what I mean? I bear the scars, but one is that defence projects are a bit different, because you are operating at the very ends of the very sort of outer limits of what technology will deliver and so on. And there are places where, in order to give yourself any chance of achieving the operational effect you're after, you do have to take some real risks and try and do things which haven't been done before. And that's so to some extent, and as I say, partly drawing on my own experience, not all of it happy in this industry, in this business, just from the government point of view, sometimes you do just have to, push the boat out, and sometimes that's justified. But on the other hand, there's also in defence a terrible tendency to go for things which are better than they need to be. There are lots of different ways of messing up defence projects, but one of the most common, perhaps the most common, is that we end up trying to build capabilities that are better than we need. Now, if you look, for example, at the history of how we got to the position where we're now trying to buy nuclear-powered submarines, that sad history goes all the way back to the very early years of this century, when defence first started thinking about what it would replace the Collins class, the present class of submarine with, and in the way that defence organisations are meant to do, they started thinking about that about 20 years in advance, and they came up with this idea that what we wanted was a submarine which was even bigger and even better and even grander than the Collins. Now, the Collins is one of the biggest conventionally powered submarines in the world, and there's a good reason for that. But they thought, no, we don't want something that's as big as the Collins. We want something which is half as big, more than half as big again. And so one of the reasons why we've ended up with this AUKUS absurdity is that we started trying to build a conventionally powered submarine, which was really bigger and better and therefore harder to build than was possible. And so I think, the most common underlying problem that makes so many defence projects go astray is that we end up trying to build things which are simply better than they need to be. And people forget the virtue of having something that's simple and that works. And, and what you find actually when defence organisations stop enjoying the luxury of peacetime and start really trying to focus on war, what they start doing is exactly that. They scrape off the gold plating, and they start getting down to something really basic that just works, and you can produce a lot of them.
So I suppose those that are in favour of this deal, and there are quite a lot of them, as you write in the I suppose what we might call the national security community, the broader community, they, I think, would look at all of the significant risks that you've outlined and your arguments about the genuine operational needs of Australian defence, and say that actually what we need, because of the, what they would describe as the worst strategic circumstances since 1945, which is something we're hearing a lot, because of those strategic circumstances, we need this so-called apex predator. That's a phrase that's kind of employed a lot.
That's right.
So why is it that you argue, despite, because I think you would agree that with that assertion about the worst strategic environment, why is it that we actually don't need this apex predator? Well,
there's two parts to the answer to that. The first is that I do buy the argument that we face the most demanding strategic circumstances since 1945. I think that might even be an understatement, because in the years before 1945, Australia's security was threatened by the challenge to our great and powerful friends by Imperial Japan, which had an economy that was maybe 1/5 the size of America's. Today, the domination of Asia by our great and powerful friend America is challenged by a country, China, which has an economy which, on the most relevant measure, is bigger than America's. And in the most fundamental sense, the strategic challenge we face is more grave. And also, of course, we live in an era of nuclear weapons, which we didn't until August 1945. So, I do think there's a very serious moment. But it's a moment that raises a very deep question, well, I might say re-raises a very deep question about Australian defence policy. Really, since we started thinking about ourselves strategically in the late 19th century, Australia has always struggled with what appears to be a very irresolvable dilemma. Because on the one hand, we think we have to depend on our allies, first Britain, then America, because we're too small and there are too few of us and the continent's too big. We can't possibly defend ourselves. On the other hand, we understand that we can't depend on our great and powerful friends because they're too far away. We're not like Canada, that sits right next door to America. Canadians worry about lots of things, but they don't worry about being abandoned by America. They sometimes worry about
they worry about the opposite, yeah.
But they never worry about being abandoned by America. Whereas Australians have always understood that the sheer fact of distance means that Britain first and then America, they always had a choice as to where they come to our assistance. And of course, in 1941, when the British had a choice, they decided not to. I don't blame them for that, mind you. I blame us for not recognising that danger. But that's an issue for Australia as well. Now, that's always been an issue. We can't depend on we can't rely on ourselves. We can't depend on our allies. And that's caused us to slot backwards and forwards between two very different conceptions of what we do with our defence forces. Do we build our defence forces to support our allies in the hope that because we support our allies, that means they will come to our assistance? Or do we build out our defence forces to defend ourselves on the basis that if the allies don't come to assistance, we'll have to do what we can? Now, the rise of China, the challenge that China poses today to America's position as a leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, reposes that dilemma for us in a more intense form. And one way of thinking about the debate about AUKUS is that AUKUS is a bet that we should stick with the United States, that we should build defence forces which are designed primarily to support the United States in resisting China's challenge and maintaining US primacy in the Western Pacific. The alternative, the other thing we could do, is to recognise that that's not going to work, to start arguing that we should build our defence forces to defend ourselves in an Asia which is no longer dominated by our great and powerful friend, and for the first time in our history, really think about how Australia can make its own way militarily and diplomatically and so on in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by Anglo-Saxon mates. And AUKUS is really a big bet on the first of those options.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when AUKUS was announced, you had 3 white dudes in different rooms, and this has been totally dropped now. But Boris was in his kind of imperial nostalgia, global Britain phase, and it was pitched to us as the revival of the Anglosphere.
Absolutely.
That's been quietly dropped now, but that's what it is.
Yeah, no. Well, it absolutely is. I mean, leaving aside the British component of it, which in strategic and historic terms is frankly bizarre. I mean, the idea that Britain comes back to play a significant strategic role in East Asia and the Western Pacific. I mean, Britain ceased to play a significant strategic role in our part of the world in 1904, when it withdrew its main fleet units to face the rising threat of the German Navy in the North Sea. It completely lost the plot after the fall of Singapore, and the last gasp was 50 plus years ago, when under Harold Wilson they withdrew all their forces east of Suez. I mean, the idea that Britain comes together, I mean, don't get me started. So, I mean, that sort of underlying strategic component is pretty ludicrous. But more fundamentally, because this is the really big story, as Australia, and I might say both sides of politics, have observed China's growing power, have observed China's growing challenge to America's place as a leading power in East Asia, that we have faced a choice, and that is the choice as to whether we try and support the United States in pushing back against China and defeat China's challenge and preserve US primacy as a foundation for the Asian order, or whether we say, well, that was nice while it lasted, but it's not going to last any longer. We need to adapt to that a new situation in which China and, of course, India and eventually Indonesia are going to be 3 Asian great powers, which more than anybody else and much more than our old Anglo-Saxon mates are going to determine the kind of environment we live in. And if we think there's a chance that they will, in doing that, pose a military threat to Australia, we need to be able to deal with that by ourselves rather than turn to the Americans and hope they'll look after us. Now, that is a choice that Australian governments have systematically made, or rather made by default, by sticking with the old idea. And, the very sort of, foundations of my reservation about AUKUS is that it perpetuates the idea that we need to build our forces to support the United States in defeating China's challenge, rather than to build our forces to make ourselves safe in an Asia in which the United States no longer plays that role. And you might say, like any good government, in fact, any good policy maker would, hey, can't we do both? And that's good policy. If anyone asks you a choice between A and B, say, can I have them? Can I have the both option? But in this case, as in plenty of others, the middle option doesn't exist, because those two kinds of conceptions of what our fundamental strategic objective is pull our forces in very different directions. The first one, supporting the United States, requires us to build a defence force to support the United States in projecting power against China. The second one requires us to build a defence force to stop China or other great powers projecting power against us. And that does pull it in quite what you might call engineering terms. It pulls in quite different directions. And that's very well illustrated by AUKUS. If you thought the primary role of the Australian Defence Force is to support the United States in a war with China, then you might conceivably argue that buying nuclear-powered submarines would make the most sense, because the things that America really needs to do in a war with China, at least some of the things it needs to do, does require nuclear power. Nuclear power for submarines makes sense if, for example, what you're trying to do is to escort an American carrier battle group, which steams along at 20 knots. You've got to have a submarine that steams along at 20 knots, which a nuclear-powered submarine can do in a conventionally powered way. If what you're trying to do is to hunt China's ballistic missile-firing submarines, nuclear-powered ballistic missile-firing submarines, you need a nuclear-powered attack submarine of your own. And those are the two primary roles for US nuclear-powered submarines. And if that's what we think we need to be doing, then you could make an argument. I wouldn't actually agree with it, but you could make an argument that having nukes is the right thing. But if your aim, instead of supporting the United States and projecting power against China, your aim is to prevent China projecting power against us, then what you want to do is to have the capacity, to put it rather bluntly, to sink Chinese or Indian or Indonesian ships, to sink the ships that they're using to project power towards us. And for that, I would argue conventionally powered submarines are much more cost effective, not because each submarine is better, but because you have a hell of a lot more of them. On the numbers, and future estimates, the cost of submarines are very rubbery, even by defence standards, but on the numbers, roughly speaking, it seems that the nuclear powered submarines are going to cost 5 times as much as a conventionally powered boat, each boat. And so that means if you spend the same money, you end up with 5 times as many submarines. Now, the government itself, Minister Conroy has said that because nuclear-powered submarines are that much faster and have all these advantages, then each nuclear submarine is worth twice a conventionally powered submarine. Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. But if they cost 5 times as much, we spend our $368 billion buying 40 or 45 conventionally powered boats. They carry a lot more. You could make a very simple sort of operational calculation that is much more effective. A fleet of 40 conventionally powered boats is much more effective than a fleet of 8 nuclear powered boats in the task we need them to perform.
Yeah. Let's go back to the United States for a moment and your argument about the strategic risks there, because I would argue that one of the biggest strategic risks to Australia is not necessarily China, but in fact the collapse or decline of American democracy and the kind of concurrent risk that Australia gets dragged into a stupid, pointless, unwinnable war for American primacy with China.
Yes.
So my question to you is, going back to one of your earlier points, what do we do if Trump comes back, given that we're in this situation?
Yeah. Well, look, I do think, Trump's threat to America's Constitution's whole way of functioning has got to be taken very seriously. And it's worth making the point that there are 2 really bad outcomes on the first Tuesday of November this year, as far as America is concerned. One's the outcome that Trump wins. The other is that he loses.
Possible. Absolutely.
Because if he loses, you know, after
especially
last
if he
time,
only loses by a little.
oh yes, if he loses by him, and if he does lose, it'll be by a whisker. I mean, you know, there are going to be 5 or 6 battleground states. I mean, you know, American elections are pretty predictable in their broad outline. It'll be by a whisker. So I think we do face a very real problem. But I'd also make the point that I don't think it's just a Trump problem, because I think and we've seen this in the Biden administration, for that matter, we saw it in the Obama administration, the United States has simply proved itself unwilling to do what's required to effectively defeat China's challenge. But it insists on keeping on talking as if it's willing to defeat China's challenge, and making all the noises and doing things like AUKUS and taking, you know, steps which really do bend the status quo over Taiwan, for example. And that ends up with the worst of both worlds. That means that we don't end up with American primacy being reasserted. We end up with a fairly significant chance of a clash. And, you know, that would be for Australia a real disaster. I mean, it's a very important part of this whole issue, which is very important to get our heads around, but quite hard to get our head around. And that is that there really is a serious risk of war between America and China, probably triggered by Taiwan, but it won't really be about Taiwan any more than, you know, what happened in 1914 was about the status of Serbs in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It will be about whether the US or China is the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific in the decades ahead. And there is a real risk that America will find itself in a situation in which, faced by a Chinese provocation, it decides it will go to war with China. It will expect us to join. In a curious, sort of tragic kind of way, whether we actually choose to join or not won't make that much difference. And I say that because I think the war will be quite quick. Well, it's worth saying to start with, there's a lot we don't know, because there's been no war between major powers since 1945. Yep. There's been no maritime war between major powers since 1945. We don't really know how these things play out. We'll be the first ever war between nuclear-armed great powers, and almost the first ever war between nuclear-armed states at all. There's only the India-Pakistan war in 2000, 2001 that is the only exemplar and very different. But I think what would most likely happen is that it would escalate very quickly to a major maritime conflict. Both sides would lose a lot of ships and a lot of aeroplanes and a lot of lives in the first few weeks. And within a few weeks, it would descend to a stalemate, and both sides would then have to contemplate escalating across the nuclear threshold. And, you know, although it would be, I'm not saying it's a trivial question whether Australia is involved or not, whether we're involved or not, you know, that just is such an unimaginable catastrophe. And that's one of the problems. People do find it unimaginable. But this is for real. Now, on that, you know, I'm absolutely not one of those who regards a war between the US and China as inevitable.
No, because it's absolutely not inevitable.
Because it's absolutely not inevitable. But the other side of that coin is that if, say, you know, this year or next year or the year after, a war breaks out, then the future historians won't look back and say, wow, where did that come from? They'll say, oh, no. Oh, you could see that coming. And the question for Australia is, well, what are we doing? What did we do to try and stop that happening? And I don't think we're going to come out very well out of that historical interrogation.
Well, I mean, he's hoping it doesn't get to that point.
Well, but let's do more than hope.
Yes. And,
you know, the fact is that if you ask, you know, Penny Wong would say, oh, well, we're encouraging both sides to pull back, and well, of course that's worth doing, but really, is that kind of effort commensurate with the scale of the dangers we face and the risks that they eventuate? I don't think so. Australia is not doing nearly enough, not doing enough in Washington, not doing enough in our region to materially reduce the risk that we face what would be the biggest catastrophe in our history.
Yeah.
At least since European settlement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just imagine if we spent about $368 billion on diplomacy and peace building.
Well, yes, but it's not money.
No.
It's political capital. Just imagine that an Australian political leader was prepared to stand up and say, we don't think America should aim to preserve primacy in the Western Pacific, because that's what's at the heart of it. And no Australian political leader has been prepared to do that. And unless and until they do, they won't be seriously engaging with the issue.
Yeah. I am conscious of the time, and I am going to go to audience Q&A. So do pop your questions in the little Q&A box if you have them. But I suppose just a final one from me, very much on that point, Hugh. Your essay outlines so clearly why you think AUKUS can and should sink. The question then becomes, how can and should we extract ourselves successfully from this deal?
Well, really good question. I mean, what we should do is to go right back to the source of this, because as we've discussed, the source is Australia's. Australia got itself into this AUKUS predicament because we got ourselves committed to the idea that the only way for us to manage our security in the decades ahead is to do whatever we can to help America preserve primacy. And we need to unpick that. We need to start recognising that whether we like it or not, the shift in the distribution of wealth and power away from the West, the global North, to the global South, and particularly away from the United States to China and India, I might say, means that the old Western domination of the Western Pacific, which has been part and parcel of the establishment of this society on this continent since 1788, that's a historical moment which has passed. And this is what Hawke and Keating meant when they talked about looking for our security not from Asia, but in and with Asia, that we have to rethink our approach to our region and recognise that we are going to be a country that needs to make its way in an Asia which is dominated by Asian states. And that's going to be difficult and uncomfortable in all kinds of ways. But hey, that's not something we have a choice about. Yeah. And so the very first thing we have to do as a country is to start accepting that the Western domination of Asia, which has completely framed our approach to our life in the region, is no longer valid. And that is something which none of our political leaders have been prepared to do.
Fortunately.
Once we make that step, it doesn't become too difficult to do all the other things, particularly because we have Donald Trump on our side by saying you can't have the submarines anyway, and the Brits will screw up their program and the whole thing will fall apart. From that side, from a practical engineering point of view, it'll fall apart of its own implausibility. But from the political and strategic, and you might even say psychological point of view, we'll have to do that ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you're right that Donald Trump will do a bit of that work for us, but there's more to it than that. Okay, I'm going to go to questions. I can see there are a lot of them, so I'll do my best to get through them, as many of as I can. I've got one here, actually from Martin Polo, which brings up actually something that you wrote early on in the essay, Hugh. I'm just going to find this quote where you said that on the announcement of AUKUS, it was immediately and almost universally acclaimed as a triumph. And Martin's question is that given the bipartisan consensus around not just AUKUS, but the alliance generally, what do you think is the best pathway for kind of derailing, I suppose, AUKUS, if it's not going to come through the major parties of government?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm going to allow myself to say, I'm not characteristically an optimistic person about these things, but I'm going to allow myself to say, I think there's more unease within the Labor Party than meets the eye about AUKUS. I mean, we saw a bit of this at the National Conference last year, but I just have a feeling that, I think not under the Labor Party's present leadership, but I think there's some chance that the Labor Party might come to rethink this. Doesn't see much chance of that happening from the coalition side. But I think the broader answer is that and this is a bit utopian perhaps, but I think it's actually the only answer to give, which is that we the voters, need to be pushing our political leaders into a much more serious conversation about Australia's strategic predicament. I mean, we're in a peculiar situation where both sides of politics are saying we're facing the worst strategic circumstances since 1945, and neither side are doing anything about it. They're not doing anything material about it in defence terms. I mean, they're spending all their dough on AUKUS submarines, which is going to do nothing for us at all. But they're not doing anything about it politically or strategically or diplomatically either. I mean, we saw this in the ASEAN summit in Melbourne this week, where, as usual, Australia's contribution to diplomacy has been essentially to read Washington's talking points to our Southeast Asian neighbours. And what we know from the way they reacted, thank you, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, is that they don't buy it. And yet we keep on saying, we keep on encouraging them to, the story of the sort of Australia's failure to get the communique out of the ASEAN summit that they hoped for is a story of us failing to persuade them to back America against China.
And also just not even recognising that ASEAN is not the forum for that.
Well, exactly. I mean, it seems diplomatically naive and everything else. So I don't know. I think, I mean, the serious answer to the question is that we won't get AUKUS right until we get our strategic predicament in the Western Pacific in the 21st century right. And the fact of this predicament has been known and understood and acknowledged actually since the early 90s and very clearly since the 2000s. And yet successive Australian governments on both sides of politics have done nothing about it. And you might say we, the voters, have failed to press them to do anything about it. And, in the end, we do get the governments we deserve. And so I think that, the answer to the question, as I say, it sounds a little utopian, but I think it might be the only answer to give, is that we have to press our political leaders to start taking these things more seriously. And, one of the disappointments is that the other forces in Australian politics, the Greens and the Teals and so on, haven't picked this up. And one of the reasons for that is that it is hard. I mean, it's easy to say, we should accommodate China's ambitions and accept that it's going to end up being the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. Well, that's got some really big downsides. And the only thing in favour of accepting it is that the downsides of the alternative, putting a significant risk of nuclear war, is even worse. But that's a hard political story to tell.
Yeah, look, and I think that the Greens and the Teals are starting to make some progress on that. It's the difficulty with defence in particular, as you are all too aware, is that it is, especially defence policy making, is quite actively anti-democratic and even uses language designed to lock people out and make them feel like they're not equipped to have opinions on.
That is true. That is absolutely true, Emma. And one of my sort of campaigns, you might even say, is to try and convince people that defence policy is not as hard as we defence types make it out to be. I mean, that's what I was trying to do in this essay.
Yeah.
This is not that hard. Do we need these things? Actually, it's just, 40 of these boats are better than 8 of those boats. Just look at the map. You can see this. So, I think that's right. But I also think that, I mean, like anything else, like any area of policy, I mean, the Australia Institute is all about this, to understand social policy or economic policy or housing policy, you've got to get into it a bit. You've got to do the work. And people just aren't willing to do the work on this stuff. And I think, because I think in the end, we are, as a country, being very slow to wake up to what's happened. I think we find it, as a country, very hard to recognise that America is no longer the strongest country in the world. That goes very deep, and it goes partly to the way we see ourselves as a country.
Yeah.
Anwar Ibrahim yesterday at ANU, in answer to a question, in his speech, said since the Meiji Restoration, to be modern and even to be civilized has been assumed to mean to be Western, and that's no longer true. A less polite way of putting that, my way of putting that, would be that for 200 years to be wealthy and strong was meant to be white, and that's no longer true. And that's something that this country is still struggling to come to terms with.
Well, and it's something that the United States is visibly tearing itself apart.
Yeah,
over.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I guess to go back to those operational questions, I can see there are actually quite a few questions in the chat about something that has come up and that even AUKUS supporters will kind of concede and that you go into in quite a lot of detail is about actually crewing these boats, the difficulty of crewing these boats. So you argue that we just couldn't, and we're not the only country that's having problems with this. The UK is as well. But I also wanted to ask you, in terms of the alternative that you're suggesting in terms of conventional boats, that would still be a problem, no?
Oh, yeah. Look, crewing submarines is a difficult thing to do because submarine service is not for everyone.
Oh, it sounds horrendous.
Wouldn't be for me, let me tell you. But it's worth distinguishing between two different kinds of problems here. In order to crew submarines effectively, you first need to get people through the door, get people into the service, and then you need to provide them with the skills they need. Now, we have enormous problems with both of those. But the problem with providing the crews we need to crew a nuclear-powered submarine fleet for Australia encompass both of them. Because we need more people through the door because the crews are much bigger. It's 120 crew or more on a Virginia class, for example, which is double the size crew of a Collins. But also they have to have much, much more sophisticated skills. And at a time when the opportunities to get to sea to develop those skills are getting smaller, the problems of crewing a nuclear-powered submarine fleet for Australia seem to be really fundamental. But on the other hand, I don't think it's impossible for Australia to find the crew and to sustain the crew cadres for a much bigger submarine fleet than we have at the moment. In the end, even I talked about a fleet of say 40 submarines, which sounds huge and amazing, and people think, how could you possibly contemplate that? Well, I'm prepared to make the argument on that. But the fact is that even if you have two crews for each submarine, which is a good idea, so you need 80 crews, and even if people spend only half of their time in their Navy career on submarines, so it means that you in effect need 160 crews, and the crews have each got 60 people. You're still only talking about needing to recruit a couple of thousand people each year from a recruitment demographic, basically 16 to 24, which is a few million. Now, can you find 2,000 young Australians who are prepared to go into a submarine service out of 2 or 3 million in that key recruitment demographic? Well, I reckon you can. You just have to pay them enough. Call me old-fashioned, but how do they get people to work in FIFO environments in Northern Australia? A long time ago, I worked on some of those mines myself. It's a pretty unpleasant environment, but I did it because they paid me a fortune. Likewise, I worked for a while on an oil rig in the North Sea. How did they get people to do that? We paid them a lot of money. So, I do think of course, I'm oversimplifying. There are a lot of management challenges, but they're management challenges, not demographic challenges. And if we have a big fleet of submarines which are reliably maintained and can get to sea regularly, then if we can get the recruits through the door, then we can give them the technical training they need in order to achieve it. So as a country, there are all sorts of reasons why we might not manage to defend ourselves, but the fact that we can't find enough people to crew submarines, I don't think is one of them. Yeah. I would say we can't do it as long as we keep approaching the challenge the way we do it at the moment, but that can change.
But that can be addressed.
It's a management problem, not a demographic problem.
Yeah, right. Thank you. I've got a question here from Michelle that I think goes to something that we were speaking to earlier and doesn't often get asked in concert with conversations about AUKUS, and that is what you think the prospects for global nuclear disarmament actually are at the moment, given the kind of strategic circumstances globally that we find them in. Are there still possibilities for disarmament?
No, I think they're exceptionally low. I think they're functionally zero. People used to talk, leaders talked about how nuclear weapons would become less significant.
Yeah.
in the post-Cold War era. That argument was based on the idea that US superiority in conventional war military capability was going to be so great that no one would ever try and challenge the United States, and the United States wouldn't have to use or even threaten to use nuclear weapons because it would always win any conventional war anyway. This was always just completely wrong. The United States ended the Cold War once the Soviet Union collapsed with a lot of conventional military power, and they showed it off to advantage, for example, in Iraq in 1990-91, and again in different ways in 2004, I guess you could say. But the fact is that particularly in relation to China, America's conventional military capability advantage has declined very sharply. Nuclear weapons are more important rather than less important. And, you know, when Barack Obama stood up in Prague in, when was it, 2008, and sort of envisaged a world without nuclear weapons.
Well, different universe.
The subtext of that is that America won't need nuclear weapons when everyone else in the world agrees to accept American primacy as a foundation for the global order. Well, not a bad idea. I mean, if I could vote for it, I'd vote for that, for all America's peculiarities. But the fact is that people weren't prepared to sign up to it. And I mean, I think the fact is that as Ukraine has shown, but it's also, I think, equally true in Asia, the risk of a conventional war in which the status of great powers as great powers is at stake, and that's really what Ukraine's all about, and that's what Taiwan is all about. The risk of that escalating across the nuclear threshold is very high. In fact, it's higher than it was during the Cold War, because during the Cold War, both sides essentially accepted the status quo. Yeah. Whereas in Russia today doesn't accept the post-Cold War status quo in Eastern Europe. China today doesn't accept the status quo in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And so the power behind the challenge is that much greater. And so I think the chances of abolishing nuclear weapons is very low. And what's more, I think those who are worried about nuclear war, and I'll put my hand up there, should be focusing more on the steps that need to be taken to prevent the nuclear weapons being used, that we have being used, than on steps to try and abolish them, because I think the first of those problems is much more urgent. Yeah,
sure. There's actually a follow-up question here from Nick Dean, who asks, how convinced are you that the submarines, assuming we get them, and of course we know that that's a big assumption, but if we did get them, how convinced are you that they would remain conventionally armed? You know, in this wartime scenario, would there be significant pressure to arm them?
Look, you never say never, but I that's not something that keeps me awake at night, because although the United States has far too few submarines, it doesn't have far too few ways of delivering nuclear weapons. And so I think the nuclear delivery functions that the United States uses its submarines for are something that the US would feel they can adequately cover with their own delivery systems. And so I think it's just unlikely that the United States would choose to push us in that direction. I mean, a much more salient point in that regard is whether or not, as the AUKUS deal unfolds, if it unfolds, if it doesn't fall into any of the traps that we've described for it, is whether at some stage in the future, and perhaps under a Trump administration, the United States doesn't come to Australia and say, look, you know, we're providing you with all this nuclear submarine capability. Why don't you in return host nuclear-armed intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Australia targeted at China? Now, that's something
they almost did ask.
Well, they asked if they could ask.
Yes.
Under the last Trump administration, and were told by the Morrison government, please don't ask that because a refusal often offends. The Biden administration has walked away from the not very loudly, but have quietly walked away from the INF option, I think it would be very likely that the Trump administration would walk straight back into an INF, a second Trump administration would walk straight back into the INF option. And even under a future Democrat administration, I think the chances of the INF, the intermediate range ballistic missile question, would return. And so it's not so much that AUKUS would drag us into hosting US nuclear weapons in our submarines. It would draw us into hosting US nuclear weapons on our territory.
Yeah. On that particularly bleak note, I'm afraid that we are out of time. My apologies that I wasn't able to get to all of the questions. There were so many of them, but thank you so much, Hugh, for this conversation and for your essay, which we've kind of barely scratched the surface of. I encourage you all to go out and get your copy. It's available in all good bookshops, and you can also subscribe to Australian Foreign Affairs. Thank you, everyone, for your excellent questions, and thank you for joining us today. We will see you next time. Thanks, Hugh.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.